The early autumn mist still clung to the rooftops when Michael Scott vanished in the coal mining community of Harlan County, Kentucky, population 10,428. That morning began with the mine shift whistle echoing down the valley, dragging a gray blanket of fog over the dirt road that led to the main street. At 6:12 a.m., Michael's younger sister, Linda Scott, waved goodbye from the porch as the 14-year-old boy, newspaper bag in hand, crossed the narrow strip of yard separating their two modest wooden houses. Michael was returning the old canvas newspaper bag his father had used in the mines, a frayed-corner bag the family had kept for nearly a decade. The woman on the porch watched Michael's figure gradually dissolve into the swirling mist, the pale green of his jacket the last splash of color on the foggy dirt road. What happened in the next 4 minutes would haunt Harlan County for nearly half a century. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys in search of forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. In 1958, Harlan County, Kentucky, was still a tight-knit coal mining community where life revolved around shifts deep inside the mountains and the narrow dirt roads connecting clusters of homes. Children walked to school, adults had known each other for generations, and anything out of the ordinary in town was quickly noticed. The Scott family lived on the edge of town in a simple wooden house. Thomas, the father who worked long shifts in the coal mine. Elaine, the stay-at-home mother accustomed to a slow pace of life, and their two children, 14-year-old Michael and 9-year-old Linda. Family life was fairly stable, built on discipline and close bonds, with Michael helping his mother by delivering newspapers each morning and handling small chores around the house. Every day at dawn, Michael rode his bike along a fixed route that passed the houses on the main street, looped around the dirt road toward the old school, then returned to the neighborhood near home, a route so familiar that many in town practically saw the boy's morning appearance as part of daily life. In the weeks leading up to the incident, a moss-green pickup truck began appearing sporadically near Michael's newspaper drop points, sometimes parked beside the post office, sometimes sitting motionless on the roadside near the sparse woods. A strange man sat inside the truck, rarely getting out, never speaking to anyone, and his presence became more noticeable as the truck started showing up at the exact times Michael began his deliveries. On the morning of the incident, Michael left home very early. Linda walked with him part of the way as usual, because she loved chatting with her brother along the route. They reached the turn toward the main street when Michael told her to head back, saying he had to finish the remaining drops and would be home before breakfast. Linda left her brother for just a few minutes to run home and grab the scarf their mother had asked for, but when she returned, the road was unnaturally empty. Michael's bicycle lay tilted on the roadside with no sign he had continued on, and her brother was nowhere to be seen. Linda called Michael's name and ran along the route, but there was no answer. Panic rising, she immediately told Elaine, and mother and daughter began searching the nearby houses, soon pulling in neighbors as daylight broke. Residents fanned out, combing patches of grass, empty lots, even the area behind the church, but found no trace except the bicycle. A few people vaguely recalled seeing a moss-green pickup truck leave town earlier than usual, but no one could pin down the exact time. As hours passed with no sign of Michael, no one still believed he had simply gotten lost or stopped at a friend's house. Fear spread, many men in town abandoned work to join the search, and Elaine, nearly hysterical, realized the situation was beyond the community's control. Finally, after hours of fruitless spontaneous searching, the family called the sheriff's office to report that Michael Scott had disappeared and was likely the victim of an abduction. The call from the Scott family reached the Harlan County Sheriff's Office just minutes after Elaine phoned it in, and the disappearance of a 14-year-old boy under unclear circumstances immediately put the morning shift on high alert, especially once Elaine described the scene and the bicycle left behind in an unnatural way. Sheriff Robert Mallory, who was far more used to handling domestic fights and land disputes than serious missing persons cases, recognized this could not wait and left headquarters immediately for the Scott home. When he arrived, The family and neighbors were still in a state of high tension. After hours of futile searching, Mallory's first priority was to restore order to the information by asking everyone to focus on exactly what they had observed, and when. He spoke with Elaine and Thomas to gather basic details: the exact time Michael left the house, what clothes he was wearing, his usual paper route, and any recent changes in routine that might be relevant. Mallory also asked for a full description of the bicycle and the exact spot where Linda found it, to establish the initial search perimeter. After collecting the general information, he turned to Linda, because her account was the only one that could potentially provide evidence of a stranger in the area. He gently had her recount everything from the moment she and her brother left the house to when she returned and found Michael gone. Linda described the moss-green pickup truck that had appeared in previous days, where it had parked, and the man she had glimpsed inside, though her statement was scattered, and she couldn't recall a license plate or distinctive features of the man. Mallory flagged this detail as a top priority lead. Based on the time Michael separated from Linda, and the distance to where the bicycle was found, Mallory pinpointed the dirt road section near the turn into the main street as the official disappearance point. There, he made a preliminary time assessment. Only a few minutes had passed between Linda turning back and discovering the bike, suggesting that if Michael had been forced into a vehicle, the perpetrator was either waiting or acted extremely quickly. Mallory marked off the area to be sealed, identified the possible exit routes a pickup truck could have used in that short window, and ordered coordination with patrol units to monitor roads in and out of town, in case the suspect hadn't gone far. Because Michael was a minor, his familiar paper route held no inherent danger, and the repeated sightings of a stranger led Mallory to classify the case as a suspected abduction, rather than a typical runaway or lost child. That same morning, he completed the intake report, opened an initial case file, and moved the incident to the county's highest priority list, preparing for the next step, processing the scene where Michael vanished. Mallory left the Scott neighborhood to shift focus to the stretch of road where the bicycle was found, treating it as the essential starting point for any field work. The dirt road before him was normally quiet in the mornings, flanked by low grass and the edge of sparse woods, conditions that would make fresh tracks more visible than usual, provided the earlier civilian search hadn't already destroyed them. He ordered everyone to keep their distance, so as not to disturb the area further, then began examining the bicycle's position. The bike lay at an angle that didn't match a natural fall, its placement right at the grass edge, suggesting some sudden force had caused Michael to abandon it. On the ground were wide tire tracks deeper than those of regular passenger cars seen around town. The compressed soil and straight direction indicated a heavier vehicle, consistent with the small pickup Linda had described. A section of grass was pushed to one side, as if a large object had stopped briefly and then pulled away, creating a clear disturbance amid the otherwise untouched surface. Mixed into the soft dirt were a few footprints too muddled by the earlier search activity to determine direction or shoe size, but Mallory still had each one flagged for later review. While documenting the scene, he also had teams retrace Michael's entire paper route to see if there were signs he had deviated or if any dropped items indicated trouble. The groups walked both directions of the familiar path, but found no unfinished newspapers, no dropped bag, and no evidence of a crash or fall. The route was completely clean, as if the journey had been abruptly severed at the bicycle's location. When cross-referencing the timeline, Linda was away from her brother for only minutes. Mallory concluded that the approach and removal of Michael happened incredibly fast, most likely by someone who had planned ahead and waited for the perfect moment. The tire track characteristics and the unnatural way the bicycle was abandoned strengthened the theory that a motor vehicle played the central role in the disappearance. The surrounding terrain also showed the vehicle could have emerged suddenly from the wooded side, or from the connecting dirt road out of town, pulled up right beside Michael while he was alone, overpowered him, and left before anyone noticed. From all the scene evidence, tire tracks wider than a car's, grass pressed down in the direction of a reversing vehicle, a paper route with no natural interruption, and a bicycle abandoned illogically. Mallory wrote in his preliminary report, "The victim most likely did not leave this location voluntarily, but was forcibly taken into a pickup truck or similar vehicle." This became the foundational basis for directing the search toward suspicious vehicles and narrowing the pool of suspects who could have entered and exited the area in the extremely short time frame around the moment Michael Scott disappeared. From the initial scene observations, Mallory assessed that a large-scale search within the town limits needed to be launched immediately to take advantage of the remaining time before natural traces were erased, while also determining whether Michael might have been taken into an enclosed area or left in a hard-to-spot location. He contacted community leaders and called for volunteers consisting of off-shift miners, families living along the paper route, and people who regularly passed through the area to join an organized search. A staging point was set up in an empty warehouse near the main street, where Mallory divided the groups by priority zones, residential areas, the row of houses behind the church, the trails leading to the fields, and all surrounding areas near the disappearance point. Each group was assigned to sweep in one-way lines to avoid overlapping footprints and to report immediately if any unusual disturbance was found. The first group swept through yards, old sheds, livestock barns, and places children sometimes used as play spots. Areas like under porches, storage bins, and anywhere Michael could have accidentally become trapped were thoroughly checked, but no signs of his presence were found. Some residents reported hearing an engine that morning, but the sound was not distinctive enough to identify a specific vehicle. Mallory noted all the information but could not draw conclusions. For additional support, he requested a K9 unit from a neighboring area be brought to town. The dogs were allowed to scent Michael's clothing and were then led along the paper route. They reacted strongly at the spot where the bicycle was abandoned, but when taken to the forest edge or toward the main road, the signals became vague, showing no clear subsequent direction of travel. This led Mallory to consider two possibilities. The scent had been mixed with the smell of a truck, or the victim had left the spot in a vehicle with closed doors, making tracking difficult. During the residential sweep, some groups reported patches of flattened grass or compressed soil, but upon closer inspection these were determined to be old traces left by livestock or farm vehicles days earlier. Abandoned houses were also checked, but showed no signs of recent occupancy. The sweep toward the church only turned up a few old shoe prints that did not match Michael's described size, and no personal items appeared. The row of houses on the east side of town, where many household storage sheds were concentrated, was considered a likely place to hide someone. However, every door was opened for inspection, and there were no signs of forced entry or the presence of anyone other than the owners. Larger homes or those with basements were entered with homeowners' permission, yet no clues were recorded. By noon that day, the search radius was extended several hundred meters beyond the town limits, but still no verified traces appeared, indicating Michael had walked in any direction on his own. Not a single jacket, newspaper bag, scrap of paper, or sign of activity belonging to him was found along the swept routes. This reinforced Mallory's conclusion from the scene that the likelihood of the victim leaving the area on his own was very low, and all indicators supported the hypothesis that the victim had been removed by a motor vehicle. The town-wide search, despite its large scale and community support, yielded no practical results that helped determine Michael's next direction of movement or where the perpetrator might have temporarily hidden him within the residential area. The lack of clear signs from the town search forced Mallory to widen the scope along directions the perpetrator could have used to leave quickly after approaching Michael. With the Cumberland River bank and the foothills of Black Mountain considered the two areas most accessible by truck, yet sparsely traveled early in the morning, search teams were spread out along the river bank, where tall grass and soft soil might retain traces if a vehicle had stopped or turned. They moved along the water's edge checking for tire tracks, dropped items, or signs someone had recently passed. However, the damp riverside soil only showed faint marks that were inconclusive, and most were identified as tracks from local residents who regularly fished or transported small goods. No traces connected to Michael or suggesting he had been brought to that area were found. At the base of Black Mountain, another team was assigned to survey the small trails leading into the forest, as these were routes a truck could slip into if the perpetrator wanted to avoid attention. The rugged terrain and loose gravel made tire tracks hard to preserve, but Mallory still ordered every soft soil spot or bush-covered area checked. Although a few scattered tire marks appeared, none matched the size or tread pattern of the tracks found at the bicycle scene. Deeper trails also showed no evidence of motor vehicle activity that day. The search quickly extended to the highway, as it was the most convenient route for a perpetrator to leave Harlan County in a short time. Mallory had teams line both sides of the road, observing every sunken patch or potential stopping point where a truck might have turned off. Gas stations, small roadside stores, and parking areas were all checked. Some store owners said they had seen a moss green truck pass early that morning, but the timing and direction they recalled were very imprecise. Additional reports were fragmentary and insufficient to confirm that was the vehicle involved in Michael's disappearance. As Mallory compiled reports from the teams, he also received a few informal statements from residents outside town. One said they saw a green truck speeding north. Another thought they had seen a similar vehicle near the Forest Road intersection. However, no one remembered a license plate, and no one could provide an accurate description of the driver. The statements varied in timing, making it impossible to plot a verifiable route or corroborate with physical evidence. Mallory continued searching under the assumption the perpetrator used the highway to leave the area without stopping in any populated spot. But even with the expanded radius, the inability to determine a plate number, exact vehicle type, driver appearance, or stopping point quickly limited all tracking directions. Tire marks on the main road had already been obscured by other traffic, erasing any potential related signs. No dropped items, no newspapers, no physical evidence proved Michael had ever been in the areas just searched. Based on the complete compilation of results, Mallory concluded that the perpetrator had left town deliberately and rapidly, rendering the expanded search unable to produce any clear progress. All efforts ended with scattered information that could not form a consistent route to determine the next direction of the moss green truck, believed connected to Michael's disappearance. The expanded search yielding no specific traces forced Mallory to return to witness statements to establish an initial suspect pool, even though they were not particularly solid. Based on the vague descriptions of the moss green truck and repeated sightings of strangers in the area before Michael vanished, he categorized potential subjects into 3 groups: strangers seen near the paper route, truck owners in town and nearby areas, and drivers who regularly traveled the highway early in the morning. Mallory ordered a review of residency records to identify anyone who had recently arrived in town or shown unusual activity in recent weeks. A man working seasonally at the lumber yard was placed on the list because he was living temporarily in the area and owned an old truck. A neighbor named Ray Coleman was also noted because he had previously annoyed neighbors and had been seen near the paper route early in the morning on multiple days. Owners of small trucks matching Linda's description were brought in to verify their whereabouts the morning of the incident. However, the preliminary interviews produced nothing conclusive. The lumberyard worker insisted his truck had been broken down since the previous day and was not used at the time Michael disappeared. An inspection at the yard showed the truck was indeed under repair, though Mallory could not absolutely confirm the exact timing of the breakdown. Ray Coleman admitted passing through the paper route area that morning, but said he was only walking his dog and completely denied any involvement. The drivers questioned generally provided verifiable schedules, some had witnesses, others had delivery receipts or timed receipts. The screening gradually revealed the leads lacked sufficient weight to keep anyone as a direct suspect. When Mallory tried to strengthen the data through local residents' accounts, he noticed many witnesses were influenced by community anxiety and began misremembering or overinterpreting what they thought they had seen. One woman insisted she saw the moss green truck stop near the post office, but the time she gave coincided with when people had already begun searching for Michael, meaning she may have seen a search participant's vehicle rather than the original one. Another witness thought he had seen a strange man watching children in town, but when describing features, she contradicted her own statement minutes earlier. The degree of memory distortion made all data unreliable. Even those claiming to have seen the green truck on the highway disagreed about the direction it was traveling, its speed, or how many people were inside. Mallory recorded everything but understood there was no overlap in the statements sufficient to form a specific hypothesis. While trying to find a physical clue to match against suspects, he re-examined items at the scene, but there was nothing to compare. No fabric scraps, no material traces left on the bicycle, no clear shoe prints to match any interviewee's shoes. The only tire track at the scene indicated vehicle type, but not ownership. This made eliminating or retaining suspects a process based almost entirely on inference rather than verification. Every subsequent interview led to the same outcome. Each person had a reasonable explanation for their movements, or cross-checking data, such as work schedules, accompanying witnesses, and sighting locations could not be disproven. No one had a clear motive, no one had a history of violence, and there were no indications any had previously approached Michael suspiciously. The initial suspect pool therefore did not narrow but instead became scattered, losing any clear focus. In his next report, Mallory noted that every investigative direction based on current leads remained faint, lacked supporting foundation, and no physical evidence yet existed strong enough to directly identify the individual involved in Michael's disappearance. The scattered results from the initial suspect list forced Mallory to move into a deeper analytical phase, focusing on 3 investigative directions that could potentially match the case characteristics: a subject known to or who had previously contacted Michael, a stranger passing through town who seized an opportune moment to approach, or a perpetrator operating on a replacement child pattern which had been sporadically recorded in neighboring states during the same period, where the offender sought young targets with physical appearance or age similar to their own lost child. Mallory created an analysis table for each direction, reviewing all collected information for matches in timing, location, and identifying features. First, he re-examined the list of people Michael knew who had a history of conflict or concerning behavior, but Michael did not regularly interact with strangers and had no recorded conflicts at school or in the neighborhood. This direction quickly yielded no further significant leads. For the stranger angle, Mallory collaborated with gas stations, small stores, and homes along the highway to gather information about the moss green truck, but the results remained only vague, imprecise accounts. The replacement child direction was considered last, not because of direct evidence, but because the nature of the incident, swift, decisive action with no traces left behind, partly resembled the perpetrator pattern noted in a few old reports from Tennessee and West Virginia, though none had occurred near Harlan County. Mallory decided not to rule out this possibility, but he needed more concrete evidence to strengthen the hypothesis. Parallel to analyzing the investigative directions, Mallory conducted a full check of all truck owners in the town and surrounding areas. He asked the administrative department to compile a list of small truck owners, especially those with color or style similar to Linda's description. The list yielded about 24 vehicles, most belonging to minors, farmers, or freelance workers. Each owner was brought in to compare information about their route on the morning Michael disappeared. Some had clear alibis, such as being in the mine during shift change, at a mechanic shop, or working in the fields with a crew. Others lacked solid alibis, but their vehicles did not match the tire tracks at the scene. Tread pattern, width, and wear were all incompatible. Mallory also had officers inspect the undercarriage, truck bed, and any areas that might retain material evidence if there had been contact with Michael, but nothing was found. A few older vehicles no longer had clear tread patterns, making comparison difficult, yet even in those cases there were no signs the truck had been used that morning. Efforts to match traces at the scene also produced no clear results. The only analyzable tire mark indicated a common tire type used by many small truck models. There was no material evidence such as fabric fibers, paint chips, or fresh cuts on the road surface to determine the direction of the turnaround. The disturbed footprints were insufficient to match any suspect's shoes. Mallory tried cross-referencing the time Michael vanished with traffic volume at the nearest gas station, but the data relied solely on employee memory and could not be accurately verified. Those who claimed to have seen the moss green truck that morning all remembered different locations and times, making it impossible to connect the sightings into a coherent route. In a final attempt to find a common thread, Mallory gathered all topographic maps around the town, marking every location where a truck could stop without drawing attention. He resurveyed the distance between the scene and town exits, cross-referencing with average travel speeds to identify areas the perpetrator might have passed through within the estimated time frame. However, each scenario opened multiple possibilities, rather than narrowing the field. No route showed clear evidence of unusual vehicle presence that morning. By the end of the in-depth investigation phase, Mallory was forced to conclude that all gathered leads failed to converge sufficiently for a breakthrough. No suspect fully matched the scene data, no statement was solid enough to reconstruct the perpetrator's route, and no physical evidence could be further analyzed with the techniques available at the time. Every cross-check, comparison, and elimination effort led back to a point where further progress was impossible, leaving a file filled with hypotheses, but no verified connection to pursue a focused investigation. Every analytical avenue in the in-depth phase circled back to a lack of solid footing, forcing Mallory to face the clear reality that the investigation was no longer producing meaningful progress. 6 months of screening, verification, and cross-checking had only thickened the reports without uncovering any new lead, capable of identifying a suspect or tracing the moss green truck's route. The existing database consisted only of scattered statements, non-distinct tire marks, and a scene disturbed too early, making it impossible to reconstruct the perpetrator's actions. Numerous vehicle inspection records, owner lists, and route surveys all revealed an absence of evidence. Even witnesses who thought they had seen the truck could not agree on timing, location, or the driver's appearance. This ambiguity rendered every comparison baseless, and each review of statements led to the conclusion that witnesses' memories had been distorted by anxiety and the passage of time. Mallory tried to find common ground among the remaining data, but no factor overlapped enough to form a new investigative direction. The areas already searched, from residential zones, riverbanks and foothills, to highways, yielded no physical trace of Michael. Deeper tire analysis failed to pinpoint a specific vehicle model, because the tire type was widely used in the region. There were no fabric samples, no paint chips, no intact shoe prints, no intermediate stop indicating where the perpetrator might have paused. The terrain within the town's radius had been searched to the point where it was unlikely any trace would have been missed if it existed from the start. From the county office, mounting requests for progress updates and detailed reports further compelled Mallory to consider moving the case to inactive status. This did not reflect giving up, but rather an acknowledgement that every method the county force could deploy had been exhausted. The case file was reviewed one final time to ensure no evidence was pending or required further testing. Everything was classified as insufficient basis for analysis. The suspect list was updated to reflect elimination or no direct relevance, with no one remaining under active suspicion. Mallory prepared a summary report stating that the investigation had reached no progress and no remaining data points justified expansion. He recommended transferring the file to cold case status to preserve and archive all documents while awaiting any future development that could change the situation. The file was closed and moved to storage, ending the active investigation phase. The Scott family received official notification that the investigation was being suspended due to lack of evidence, and though no one wanted to accept it, they understood that half a year of searching had produced no sign of Michael's whereabouts. With this step, the case was placed on hold, not due to lack of determination, but because no further tools, data, or viable direction remained to dig deeper, leaving an unsolved file and an unfillable void in the pursuit of truth. The events from Michael's side, reconstructed years later, show that the moment he disappeared aligned perfectly with all the observations Mallory had recorded at the scene. While continuing his paper route after Linda turned back, Michael noticed the moss-green truck he had glimpsed a few days earlier, now parked ahead on the road, pulled close to the grass as if waiting for someone. He had no reason to think he was being watched, but the truck's appearance at that exact moment made him slow down for a second, watching the man inside. The man stepped out with a friendly demeanor, but approached too quickly, preventing Michael from backing away. A brief feeling of alarm never fully formed into a reaction before the man's arm grabbed him, yanking him off balance from the handlebars and forcing him toward the truck bed. The truck made little noise, but the strong shove caused Michael to lose his footing, and before he could respond, he was pulled into the rear compartment, where the door slammed shut almost instantly. The truck accelerated fast enough that all outside sound vanished within seconds. The interior of the truck bed was dark and cramped to the point that he couldn't tell which direction they were moving. The floor vibrated with every bumpy stretch of road, and the only sensations were the smell of metal mixed with oil and the coldness of the surrounding walls. There were no windows or light slits to gauge the time of day. He tried listening to the engine to estimate travel distance, but the sound mixed with gravel under the tires rendered it useless. Based on the prolonged dragging sensation and the vehicle's shaking, Michael was likely taken out of town on a back road before merging onto a main route leading to more remote areas. He couldn't measure time amid the jolts, but the motion changed a couple of times, indicating turns or steeper sections. Any attempt to find a handhold or escape the compartment was impossible, because the perpetrator had locked it securely from the outside. When the truck stopped, the sudden silence told Michael this was not a residential area or a road with traffic, as there was no sound except faint wind. The man opened the door, pulled him onto hard ground, and led him to a small wooden structure set back from the main road. This was the first detention place Michael remembered. Inside the wooden cabin, there was only a bed, a few old items, and no means of communication or escape except the door locked from the outside. The distance between the cabin and where the truck stopped indicated it was deep in a rarely visited area, most likely far enough from any settlement that even if Michael screamed, no one would hear. The moment he was pushed inside, Michael lost all connection to the outside world. There was no vantage point to determine location, no human sounds, no indication whether he was still near Harlan County or had been taken elsewhere. He didn't know if he was being held near a populated area or on private land. He had no information to tell whether the man was acting alone or with others. Every familiar frame of reference vanished completely, leaving a confined space where Michael could only rely on instinct to guess whether he was temporarily safe or facing something worse. From the instant the wooden door slammed shut, Michael was placed in total isolation, with no ability to seek help or escape. The truck, the travel route, and the initial detention site, later recounted by him years afterward, all matched the assessment that the abduction was carried out quickly, precisely, and with preparation, ensuring that no matter how urgent the search efforts were, they could not pick up the trail in time on the day he vanished. The space inside the wooden cabin, where Michael was taken, created the first circle of restraint around him, and the initial captivity phase began with the man establishing absolute control over every one of his actions. In the first days, Michael was not allowed to stand near the cabin's only small window, or to walk more than a few steps away from the wooden bed pushed against the wall. Every time the man entered, the boy was required to sit still or stand in a fixed spot. Every question was ignored, and any movement that differed from the order was met with shouting or the threat of a hard yank. The man brought food and water at random times with no fixed schedule, making it impossible for Michael to predict the cycle of the day. The only thing that let him sense whether a day had passed was the slight changes in natural light filtering through the cracks. Information isolation was meticulously enforced: no newspapers, no radio, no object that could carry news or outside sounds. He heard no cars, no voices, no sound that suggested human activity nearby. This made it impossible for him to figure out whether he was in a forest, a farm, or abandoned land. Whenever the man left, he left no clue about the direction he took. The door was always locked the moment he stepped out, and any noises from outside were distant and impossible to interpret. Michael tried peering through the tiniest cracks, but the wooden structure was sealed tight, rendering every attempt useless. He once tried listening at the door, waiting for the man to slip up, but the man always appeared suddenly with almost no footfalls. One time Michael pressed himself against the wall, hoping that when the door opened the man wouldn't notice him, and he could dart past, but the cabin was too small, and the man's reflexes too fast. He was instantly shoved back onto the bed. Another time he tried using an old metal spoon to pry the door latch, while the man was gone longer than usual, but the door was reinforced with metal plates on the outside, so he only managed to scratch the inner wood without budging the hinges. Control over movement was maintained through direct commands and constant observation whenever the man was present. Michael gradually realized that even the tiny amount of free movement inside the cabin was limited by the man's sharp gaze. The man always stood blocking the exit as a reminder that anything outside his wishes was forbidden. When Michael asked if he could go outside for a moment, the only response was silence and a discouraging stare. The air in the cabin grew heavy and suffocating. Many times Michael tried pressing against the walls to hear sounds or touching the knots in the wood to see if any rotten section could be pushed out, but even these small ideas were crushed by the perpetrator's constant presence. His early escape attempts, however fragile the hope behind them, never turned into effective action. There was no object in the cabin sturdy enough to use as a tool, no foothold to climb, no gap wide enough to squeeze through. Each failure made Michael understand more clearly that the cabin was not a temporary place, but a purpose-built detention site designed to leave no trace to the outside world. The silence, the simple yet effective construction, and the tight control over daily life gradually stripped away his ability to distinguish day from night, and every spark of resistance faded under the man's vigilance. From Michael's viewpoint, this phase of supervision was not just days locked in a cramped space, it was the beginning of the feeling that he had been severed from the world, with no way back to his old life or to his family, even though he kept looking for tiny risky moments to try to break free from the man's control. The initial captivity phase in the wooden cabin ended when the man decided to move Michael to another location, and the transfer happened so suddenly that the boy had no time to anticipate anything. The man woke him at what Michael could only guess was near dawn based on the faint light seeping through the cracks, signaled him to stand, then loosely tied his wrists with an old but strong piece of rope to control his movement. Being led outside let Michael breathe open air for the first time after days locked inside, but he couldn't see the surrounding terrain because he was forced to keep his head down and walk right behind the man. After a few steps, he was put into the bed of a pickup truck, the tailgate slammed shut, and the vehicle started moving over stretches of road noticeably longer than during the original abduction. From the jolting and the slope of the road, Michael sensed the truck was leaving the sparse forest and heading into a wider area, perhaps near fields or deserted farmland. The next stop was a property with much sturdier structures than the previous cabin. When the tailgate opened, Michael found himself in front of an old farm with a wooden main house, a large barn, and a few scattered livestock sheds behind it. The place was completely quiet, with no sign of multiple people living there, and the buildings were spaced far enough apart that any sound from the main house would barely reach the road. The man untied his wrists, but kept him under control by pushing him along a narrow path leading down into the barn. The new holding space was larger, but designed to prevent escape. The windows were sealed with thick boards, leaving only a few tiny slits for light. The only entrance was a door reinforced with metal bars on the outside that couldn't be opened from inside. The wooden walls were thicker, with no rotten pieces that could be pried loose like in the old cabin. The change of location brought no hope, only the feeling that the man had prepared a longer-term prison. From the moment they arrived at the farm, the man's control became even stricter. Michael was confined to the room all day, and only allowed out when the man demanded it, usually for very short trips to use the bathroom or move to another part of the barn. Every movement was closely watched. Food and water were still provided irregularly, making it hard for Michael to predict when the captor would appear. Whenever he tried asking why he was being kept or what was happening, the man responded only with short commands or total silence. Time spent at the farm was no longer marked by clear changes between day and night. The light coming through the slits was too weak to tell time, and the man's unpredictable appearances destroyed any sense of routine. Michael no longer knew how long he had been there. The passage of time grew increasingly blurred. Changes in weather, colder air, stronger wind, or higher humidity, were the only clues that helped him guess. Seasons were passing, but they weren't enough to maintain a real sense of calendar time. Disorientation became stark when Michael could no longer picture which direction the town lay in. He had once tried counting vehicle stops or gauging road vibrations to estimate distance, but after being moved to the farm and kept in a sealed space for days on end, all attempts at orientation became meaningless. The man never said anything to indicate whether they were near or far from Harlan County, and the farm's isolation made it impossible to tell if a main road was nearby. Each day blurred into an unbroken chain, making Michael realize this was not a temporary spot but a detention site. The man had chosen to keep him under long-term control, completely cut off from any chance of finding his way home or being accidentally discovered. The prolonged time at the farm gradually pulled Michael into a state of forced dependence, not born from trust, but from the total loss of autonomy in an environment under absolute control. Basic needs like food, water, clothing, and even knowing whether it was day or night were entirely in the man's hands, and the instability of daily routines left Michael with no choice but to wait for each of the man's appearances to meet the bare minimum for survival. His body grew exhausted from the monotonous repetition, his mind weakened from the lack of information or interaction with anyone else, creating a reality he couldn't escape even in his thoughts. He didn't know what resistance might lead to, and the invisible fear combined with constant surveillance made the idea of fighting back fade over time. The living space at the farm isolated Michael from any form of social contact. He heard no voices, saw no one except the perpetrator, and there was no community activity to indicate whether he was still near civilization or deep in remote countryside. In the early days he still tried listening for outside sounds to find clues, but gradually, the absolute silence made him unaware of anything happening beyond the wooden walls. Having no windows open to the outside meant he couldn't tell if it was raining, sunny, or if anyone was working nearby. In such an isolated environment, seeking help became impossible. Any hope of escape dwindled, as Michael realized the man only left the farm for short periods, and every time the door was locked from the outside. The man's footsteps and movements were always brief and unpredictable, so Michael never knew when he would return. The rare times he was taken outside, usually just a few minutes in the backyard area of the barn, offered no opportunity. The open space around the farm was too vast, with no cover, and no nearby path he could reach without being caught in the first few seconds. Not knowing directions or where the main road was made any escape attempt pure suicide. Living conditions were kept at the minimum needed to prevent collapse but offered no comfort. Meals were usually small pieces of bread, plain water, or other simple food, sometimes forgotten or delivered late, forcing him to endure prolonged hunger. His sleeping spot was an old wooden bed with a rough blanket that wasn't warm enough on cold days, and there was nothing else to make the space feel like a real living area. The walls and floor were rough wood that creaked faintly when the temperature changed, often waking Michael in the night without knowing how long he had slept. Stripped of everything that helped maintain a sense of self, Time began passing in a way Michael could no longer measure. Days, weeks, and months blended into one unbroken stretch. He gradually lost the ability to estimate time by light or sound, and the captor's control over daily life, threw his sleep-wake cycle completely off natural rhythm. Sometimes Michael thought only a few weeks had passed, but small changes in weather or the clothes the man brought made him realize months of captivity had gone by. In this state, dependence became not just physical but psychological. Being unable to rely on himself to know the time, location, or direction made Michael cling to the brief moments when the man appeared as the only way to maintain what little rhythm of life remained. Every day he looked for any sign that the situation might change, but when nothing happened beyond the man's repetitive behavior, he accepted that this farm was not temporary. It was a prison with no known end date. The prolonged isolation made it impossible for Michael to predict any change, and the constant instability of his surroundings meant he didn't realize the turning point was approaching until the perpetrator's regular appearances suddenly stopped. In the days before, the man had come in with food at irregular but still life-sustaining intervals. Now the gaps between visits grew unnaturally long. No footsteps, no door sound, no sign of his presence. At first Michael thought it was a new form of control or deliberate pressure, but the silence dragged on until suspicion turned to worry. He called softly through the door crack. No answer. He pressed his ear to listen for movement outside. Nothing. When hunger, thirst, and absolute quiet stretched beyond anything familiar, Michael understood something unusual had happened. The decision to approach the door came when he realized that if he didn't find a way out himself, no one else was coming back to open it. With what strength he had left, he threw his shoulder and full body weight against the old slightly rotted wood at the bottom edge. After repeated attempts, the inner latch gave a little thanks to years of termite damage, creating a gap wide enough to wedge his foot in and push further. The door finally swung open slowly with a dry creak. The space outside was completely still, with no trace of the man. Michael edged across the small farmyard to the main house, whose door was also unlocked. Inside, he found the man lying motionless on the floor, no signs of struggle. The body showed he had been dead for several days, most likely from natural causes such as a stroke or heart attack. Not knowing what to do with this information, Michael left the house and stood in the middle of the open land, feeling free air for the first time in years yet having no idea where to go. Leaving the farm was the first step, but everything beyond the boundaries of his captivity was so unfamiliar that he couldn't determine any direction. No identification, no personal belongings, no clear memory of the geographic location, no idea which way the nearest town lay. His own voice sounded strange when he instinctively tried calling for help, but the empty land answered with total silence. Michael followed the only dirt road connecting the farm to the outside world, hoping to meet someone or find a sign leading to civilization. However, the winding stretches and unmarked forks quickly left him disoriented. Years without information about the outside world meant he didn't know where to safely seek help. He wasn't sure whether to approach a roadside house, stop at a store, or avoid populated areas altogether out of fear of being sent back. Every decision was guesswork, and the guesses often contradicted each other. Michael walked until exhaustion forced him to rest in dense wooded areas, finding water from streams and food wherever he was lucky enough to meet kind people willing to share a meal. This wandering lasted not just weeks but became an involuntary way of life, because he couldn't clearly explain who he was, where he came from, or what had happened to him. The long captivity had blurred memories of Harlan County and the way home. Whenever anyone asked about his background, he couldn't provide useful details that would make them understand his situation. He didn't even fully remember dates or his own age, and without any ID, approaching any agency was nearly impossible. In a state of prolonged caution and mental disarray, Michael entered a phase of existence where every day was the same: move, find shelter, find food, try not to draw attention, and hope to avoid dangers he couldn't predict. This marked the beginning of a decades-long journey, with no destination, no map, and no clear awareness of whether anyone in the world was still looking for him. Leaving the farm without any orienting information forced Michael into a survival-based existence rather than an active attempt to reclaim his old life, and this period gradually shaped a nomadic lifestyle that carried him across many different regions. He traveled minor roads linking rural communities, sometimes hitching rides with kind truck drivers, sometimes walking dozens of miles just to find a place to sleep. Whenever he reached a new area, he never stayed long because constant unease pushed him to leave before anyone could ask about his past. Temporary helpers might give him a meal or an old jacket, but no one had reason to keep him or dig deeper. When he accidentally neared larger towns or busy intersections, the overwhelming noise and unfamiliar pace of life drove him back to quieter places where fewer people paid little attention to a young man walking along the road. Throughout these years, Michael almost never approached public services or social support organizations, partly because he didn't understand the procedures or know what to say when asked for a name or address, and partly because prolonged isolation had destroyed his ability to trust any kind of official system. Seeing a police station, hospital, or community center, his first instinct was not to walk toward it, but to turn in the opposite direction. The lack of identification convinced him that if he explained wrong or revealed his fragmented memories, he might be detained for reasons he couldn't understand. This kept him completely outside society. No accounts, no documents, no administrative trace for nearly 2 decades. With no personal information to cross-reference, Michael never matched any missing person records during that time, even though his name had once been entered in Harlan County reports. While he drifted through states like Tennessee, Virginia, and sometimes farther south, missing person databases across states were not yet linked, and his file only described a 14-year-old boy who vanished in 1958, a description that could not possibly connect to a weary young man with no indication he had ever come from Kentucky. No one asked deeper questions because Michael said very little, or gave only short, hard-to-interpret answers. Those who met him later only remembered a young person with a distant gaze, difficult to reach, and never staying long enough to form any relationship. Over time, the image he presented to the communities he passed through blended into the familiar sight of unidentified homeless people, mixing in at old train stations, vacant lots beside highways, areas behind markets, or unmanaged shelters. He learned to survive by taking leftover food, doing small cash jobs that required no papers, or simply moving to less populated places to avoid trouble. Long hair, worn clothes, a posture that wasn't fully upright, and eyes that usually looked down kept him from standing out, and this unintentionally helped him maintain a quiet existence without being forced to declare or prove anything. By the late 1990s, Michael was still living without knowing that his existence had repeatedly brushed the edge of systems that could have identified him. No papers, no name, no clear family memories. He had become a shadow moving through society's gaps, a person no one was searching for in the right way, because no one knew he was still alive, and a person who could no longer say who he was because every reference point for returning to his old life had been erased during the long years of captivity and wandering. While Michael continued existing on society's margins without leaving any administrative trace, a quiet but pivotal change was taking place in Kentucky in the late 1990s as the state began rolling out DNA identification systems as part of forensic modernization. State laboratories received new equipment, investigators were trained to collect and preserve biological samples to modern standards, and hundreds of old cases, including decades-old disappearances, were reviewed for integration into the federal identification network. This shift was not aimed at any specific case, yet it opened the door for files like Michael's, which had sat dormant in cold cases for years with no new leads. When the turn came for old missing person cases to be digitized, Michael's file was reviewed to determine priority level. Though original documentation was sparse, it was classified for long-term preservation because the victim was a minor, and the circumstances suggested abduction. The worn folder, containing Linda's statement, scene map, truck description sketch, and list of cleared suspects was scanned and stored electronically. Michael's physical description at the time of disappearance was standardized into the new format, enabling the system to use it as a reference during future data matching. One key requirement of this phase was collecting reference DNA samples from living family members to build datasets that could be compared against unidentified cases now or in the future. The Scott family, though time had all but erased hope, agreed to participate when contacted by authorities. DNA samples from Michael's parents and sister Linda were taken to create an updated identification profile under the state's new standards. With samples from multiple close relatives, the system could generate a robust genetic dataset capable of matching any unnamed sample entered into the network. Updating Michael's file happened quietly, but laid critical groundwork for the next breakthrough. Investigators noted that although the case was inactive, placing it in the DNA system could enable identification if unidentified remains were ever found anywhere in the state or neighboring states. No one imagined the missing person might still be alive. The goal at the time was simply to ensure that if an unidentified case surfaced, the system would know which file to link it to. Every update was documented and entered into the new database. The name Michael Scott, a victim missing since 1958, was added to the modern forensic system, alongside hundreds of others. It was the quiet presence of this DNA reference data, entered without anyone expecting quick results, that created the foundation for authorities, later to recognize that an unidentified man, wandering in another state, was in fact the 14-year-old boy abducted from Harlan County, more than 4 decades earlier. After the Scott family's DNA samples were collected and standardized under the new forensic protocol, this data set was directly linked to the state's identification system, creating a complete genetic profile for matching against any unidentified samples. Michael's file, which previously existed only on paper with a few notes and a physical description from when he was a 14-year-old boy, now received the most critical component that modern forensic technology could process, a set of DNA markers representing his immediate family. This connection transformed the old file into a fully functional cold case profile, capable of automatically matching with biological samples collected in the future or already pending from unsolved cases. Creating Michael's DNA profile was not simply a matter of attaching the family samples to the file. The system also constructed a genetic characteristic string based on statistical algorithms that allowed comparison across various levels of sample degradation. Laboratories also placed Michael's name into the group of profiles requiring periodic monitoring to ensure that if any forensic lab in the system uploaded an unidentified sample with compatible characteristics, his file would be immediately flagged. This feature was especially important in the context of a national DNA system that was gradually forming but not yet fully interconnected. Only cold cases marked as priority had a chance of being reviewed regularly. During the re-evaluation of case files, a list of incidents was categorized by severity, length of time pending, and likelihood of identification through DNA. Michael's disappearance, despite having occurred 4 decades earlier, was still classified as a high-value search because the victim went missing as a child. The circumstances clearly involved criminal elements, and sufficient archive documentation existed to coordinate with modern DNA data. As a result, his file was placed into the Cold Case Unit's priority catalog, among the cases that required automatic comparison whenever the system received a new unidentified sample. The waiting for match phase, a step that sounds passive, was in fact the core element that later enabled Michael's file to be identified. Every time a laboratory in the state or from neighboring states uploaded an unnamed DNA sample, the system ran a comparison against the entire cold case database. In the vast majority of these instances, there were no matches. However, the fact that Michael's file now had a complete DNA profile ensured that the moment a compatible sample was entered, whether from a person without identification, a nameless homeless individual, or an unidentified victim, the system would instantly recognize the connection to the Scott family. This process did not happen with fanfare or advance warning. In the late 1990s, Michael's file simply sat in the list of DNA-enabled cold cases, automatically scanned whenever new data was collected. From the investigator's perspective, it was merely part of the state's effort to digitize and standardize cold cases. No one placed special expectations on a file more than 40 years old producing any breakthrough. Yet attaching the file to the DNA database and placing it on the priority list was the decisive link that created the possibility of a future connection. A possibility that the traditional investigative methods of 1958 could never have produced. As Kentucky's DNA system began operating stably and cold case files were fully integrated, an event that seemed unrelated took place in early 2001, opening a turning point no one could have predicted. In a small town in Tennessee, local police were notified about a homeless man wandering near the downtown area, appearing disoriented and with fragmented memory. The man was not dangerous, but his incoherent speech and inability to provide a name or address led social services workers to contact police for help verifying his identity. When brought to the station, he carried no identification documents and no personal items, except an old jacket and a small bag containing nothing of identifying value. Basic questions about his name, age or place of birth received no clear answers. The man only spoke in broken phrases about dirt roads, a farm, and walking a very long time, leading authorities to conclude this might be a case of long-term memory loss or psychological trauma. Following procedure, police took his fingerprints and entered them into the system for comparison with criminal and state ID databases, but the results showed no matches. This was not uncommon for homeless individuals, but certain characteristics, the prematurely aged appearance, vagueness in speech, and avoidance of personal information, prompted them to forward the data to the federal system for cross-checking. Hours later, a weak alert appeared in the cold case system, not from the fingerprint database, but from a cross-referencing algorithm designed to link incomplete records. The alert suggested that the man's description and estimated age might match a long-missing person case from Kentucky, though the match was still very preliminary. This was enough for Tennessee police to contact Kentucky to verify whether any cold case might be related. When photographs and basic identifying information were sent to Kentucky's cold case unit, investigators there reviewed the list of missing persons cases from decades earlier. Although there were no adult images of the victim for visual comparison, indicators such as height, bone structure, signs of aging, and the vague mention of a farm in the man's speech aligned with the never fully closed Michael Scott file. Since the matching signal originated from the DNA-enabled cold case system, the next step was almost obvious: obtain a biological sample from the man for direct comparison with the Scott family DNA profile that had been in the system since the late 1990s. Tennessee authorities collected a sample via oral swab under forensic standards and sent it to Kentucky's authorized laboratory. The sample was entered into the DNA system as no identity, and analysis began to determine the degree of match with existing cold case data. No one at that moment imagined that the test results could be connected to a disappearance spanning 4 decades, but processing the DNA sample according to standard protocol ensured that if there was a genetic match, the system would recognize it immediately. This examination proceeded like routine processing for an unidentified homeless person, but the early appearance of a cold case signal showed that the system had accomplished what humans could not for decades, connecting two ends of a puzzle that seemed completely separated: a wandering man who could not say who he was, and a 14-year-old boy who vanished in 1958. The unidentified man's DNA sample was transferred to the Kentucky laboratory and quickly entered into the standard analysis process, which had been optimized for comparison with the cold case database. When the matching software ran through the reference DNA profiles, one result appeared far clearer than the earlier weak signals: the new sample's genetic sequence matched the Scott family DNA at a level assessed as absolute match probability within direct blood relations. The laboratory ran the comparison a second time to rule out error, and the result remained the same. The homeless man in Tennessee had a biological relationship consistent with being Michael Scott, the 14-year-old child who disappeared from Harlan County in 1958. After 4 decades without answers, the DNA system provided the confirmation that traditional investigative methods could not. The electronic file automatically flagged the case and sent notification to Kentucky's Cold Case Unit, where investigators tracking long-term cases immediately reviewed the results. They re-examined all archived documents, from the original scene report and Linda's statement to the sketch of the moss green pickup truck. Though those details could no longer be directly verified against reality, they were now placed in a new context. The victim had not only been found, he was still alive. An official notification was drafted to send to the Scott family. With the utmost caution, investigative representatives first contacted Linda, now an adult, and informed her that the DNA of an unidentified person in Tennessee showed a strong match with the family profile. The message did not jump to conclusions but walked through each step of the verification process to prepare the family for the emotional impact, because finding someone missing for nearly half a century alive was so rare as to be almost unbelievable. When they were assured that the results had been independently verified twice by the laboratory, the certainty of the conclusion left them in a state of both joy and shock. The Cold Case Unit was also convened to assess the impact of successfully identifying the victim. The fact that a person missing since 1958 appeared in the system through DNA data raised larger questions about the circumstances of the disappearance, the survival process, and the status of any perpetrator. The file needed to be reopened under procedure to verify related factors, because Michael's identity was no longer a hypothesis but a fact confirmed by undeniable scientific method. From a legal standpoint, confirming identity was only the first step. The next was to fully re-evaluate the entire case based on the new data and any statements that might be obtained from Michael himself. Authorities began preparing to transport the unidentified man from Tennessee to Kentucky for formal identification procedures and initial medical support. Psychologists, social workers, and investigators were coordinated to handle this extraordinary case together, because Michael was not just a cold case victim who had been found, he was a survivor after an unimaginable length of time off the grid. Within the Cold Case Unit, this was regarded as a turning point that opened the opportunity not only to close a decades-old file but also to determine what had happened during Michael's missing years. Although no formal questions had yet been posed, the investigators understood that reopening the file was the inevitable next step. The victim's identity no longer needed proving. What now required deeper verification was the journey that had taken him from a dirt road in Harlan County to a nameless life in Tennessee, and whether any traces remained to trace the responsibility of the person who had kept him all those long years. The DNA confirmation that the unidentified man was Michael Scott forced the Cold Case Unit to fully reopen the entire file that had been frozen since 1958. The old documents were pulled from storage and spread across the investigators' tables. Every report page and every sketch was re-examined through the eyes of a modern generation of detectives equipped with tools and analytical standards far beyond anything Sheriff Mallory had in his day. Looking at the file with fresh perspective, the investigators quickly identified several weaknesses in the original investigation. The search area was broad, but lacked structure. Information about the moss green pickup truck was never cross-referenced with vehicle registration records from neighboring counties, and witness statements, though diligently recorded, never produced a robust enough analytical system to accurately eliminate or narrow down suspects. The absence of forensic tools, biological sample collection protocols, and federal databases at the time made the case easy to stall, especially since the perpetrator acted discreetly and left no direct traces. While reviewing the files, the name of a person who had only faintly appeared on the original suspect list was brought back into focus: Earl Henson, a farmer living on the edge of Harlan County in the late 1950s. Henson had been mentioned in a few witness statements about a stranger seen near the paper route in the week before Michael disappeared, but because there was no concrete evidence, and because he lived alone with minimal community contact, he never became a primary suspect. At the time, police visited Henson's farm only once, found no resistance or obvious clues, and the check ended quickly. His file also noted irregular travel between neighboring states and seasonal labor history, details that in 1958 were not considered suspicious. When investigators compared Michael's modern-day recollections, fragmented descriptions of a dirt road, a farm, a log shed, and a storage structure, with the description of Henson's farm on old county land maps, they noticed an eerie similarity. Although the farm structures had changed over time, distinctive locations like the old barn, the low-ceiling storage building, and the land isolated from residential areas still matched Michael's memory closely enough to form a solid investigative foundation. Digging deeper, the cold case unit discovered that Henson had died in 1985, the exact period when Michael said he finally escaped captivity. That single fact suddenly reconnected a chain of events broken for nearly half a century and filled gaps the original file could never explain. From there, the investigation shifted focus to analyzing Henson's activities between 1958 and 1985, including digging up old reports, land records, residence changes, and medical history, all to determine whether he had the means to carry out long-term abduction and imprisonment, as Michael described. Many factors suggested it was feasible: the farm's isolation, his reclusive personality, lack of community interaction, and unexplained trips outside the county. Once the chain of reasoning was strong enough, the cold case unit decided to conduct a new comprehensive search of the entire Henson property, now owned by a distant relative and largely abandoned. A search warrant was obtained on grounds of collecting evidence related to an unsolved kidnapping. Modern investigators arrived with ground-penetrating radar, structural analyzers, thermal cameras, and a full array of forensic tools to hunt for details the 1958 search could never have detected. The farm was divided into search zones, with the storage building, the collapsed shed out back, and any underground features beneath the old foundation flagged as highest probability locations. Their goal was not only to find remaining traces of Michael, but to identify any evidence that Henson had kept someone captive for an extended period. This search, built on modern technology and data, marked the transition from simply confirming the victim's identity to attempting to fully reconstruct a crime scene that had been buried under more than 4 decades of time. The reopening of the investigation and the focus on Earl Henson's farm led the cold case unit to conduct a thorough modern standard search, an operation incomparable to the cursory 1958 check. From the moment they arrived, investigators deployed ground-penetrating radar (GPR) to map subsurface structures and 3D mapping equipment to reconstruct buildings as they existed in different eras, ensuring no area hidden or altered over time was missed. Thermal sensor cameras were used to detect unusual voids inside old walls, wooden floors, and sections of ground that appeared disturbed. The objective was not only to find traces linked to Michael, but to uncover any enclosed space Henson might have used to hide or imprison someone. After hours of analyzing GPR signals around the storage building and main house, investigators detected an anomaly beneath a section of ground behind the storage building, an area completely absent from old land surveys and never examined during the original investigation. The size and depth of the return signal indicated it was not a natural depression, but a man-made structure. When they excavated the rotted surface, a narrow passage led down to a hidden cellar, thick with dust and showing decades-old reinforced timber. The cellar was large enough to hold a person for an extended period, had a crude air vent, and contained scattered remnants of daily living items. Its existence aligned strikingly with Michael's memory of a windowless sealed confinement space. Inside the cellar, investigators recovered several items of particular value: a rusted metal cup, scraps of rotted cloth, and a partially decomposed blanket, all matching objects Michael had described from his early years of captivity. Using modern forensic techniques, fiber samples and stains from the blanket were extracted for DNA and synthetic fiber analysis, dating, and possible linkage to 1950s-era materials. Investigators also found faint scratch marks on the wood near one corner, consistent with fingernail scraping, and analysis of that wood showed wear patterns matching long-term confinement. The presence of these traces, though faded by time, strongly supported the theory that Henson initially kept Michael in this cellar, before later moving him to the storage building above, exactly as Michael had described, but could never precisely locate. In the storage building area, thermal scanning revealed a false wall behind an old shelving unit. Removing the panel exposed a narrow cavity containing a dented tin can, frayed rope, and cloth food wrappings. None of the items were intact enough for full analysis, but the simultaneous presence of daily living objects in a concealed space indicated it had been used as temporary holding or storage. When the physical evidence was combined with Michael's recollections, investigators were able to establish a relatively clear captivity timeline. Michael was taken directly to the hidden cellar immediately after abduction, and spent the initial phase in cramped and in total darkness. He was later moved to the upper storage building, when Henson felt the need to spread risk, or when the cellar began to deteriorate. These details matched Michael's descriptions of moving from a place of only walls and silence, to one with more wind noise and empty space, and they aligned with the dating analysis, showing when the cellar timber began to rot. The modern tech search of the farm illuminated points the original investigation had missed, provided physical evidence that corroborated Michael's account, and confirmed Henson's farm as the site of prolonged captivity. For the first time in over 4 decades, investigators could reconstruct the timeline using both the victim's testimony and empirical data, something 1958 technology could never achieve. Once the search of the Henson farm was complete, and the recovered evidence matched Michael's memories, the cold case unit moved to the next phase, arranging family identification to legally re-establish familial ties. The DNA match had already brought Michael back to Kentucky, but reintegrating a person missing for over 4 decades into civic life required multiple layers of verification. The first identification meeting was held in a private room at State Police Headquarters with lighting softened to reduce stress for Michael, who was still deeply affected by years of isolation and wandering. Linda Scott, the younger sister who had witnessed his last moment in 1958, was invited first. The instant she entered the room, the air grew thick, as though 43 years were flowing backward. Linda studied every feature of the man before her, the same gray-blue eyes, the small scar beside his right temple that had never faded, the hunched posture, and she recognized her brother not through reason, but through instinct. She broke down in tears, yet recognition was not based on emotion alone. It was cross-checked with family photos, old medical records, and a third independent DNA test to eliminate any possibility of error. When all 3 sources, relative recognition, photographic records and DNA, aligned, Michael was officially declared the 1958 missing person, and his legal identity was restored. After confirmation, Kentucky's legal system had to address a rare situation: a citizen missing for 4 decades who existed in no administrative, tax, insurance, or hospital records. Civil documents were drafted from scratch: duplicate birth certificate, identification papers, temporary medical file, and basic citizen rights. Because of the case's nature, many procedures were expedited, so Michael would not fall into a legal void, while allowing social service organizations grounds to assist him. Meanwhile, medical teams conducted a full physical evaluation, covering nutrition status, latent illnesses from prolonged homelessness, and effects of captivity during adolescence. Results showed nutrient deficiencies, sleep disorders, weakened immune system, and abnormal reactions to noisy or crowded environments, requiring doctors to create a long-term plan, focused first on physical recovery and biological stabilization, before beginning psychological therapy. Psychologically, Michael required an even more specialized path. More than 20 years of homelessness and near-total social detachment made interacting with strangers difficult, maintaining focus challenging, and certain sounds could trigger memories of captivity. Specialists diagnosed complex PTSD, partial memory disorder, and strong social avoidance reflexes. Therapy was designed with gradually increasing exposure, with Linda playing a pivotal role. Her familiar presence made Michael feel safe enough to participate. Many times, fragmented childhood memories resurfaced when Linda mentioned old routines, the paper route, the neighbor's dog, the morning mine whistle, and those fragments became anchors specialists used to rebuild the identity, interrupted for decades. Once identity confirmation and initial support stabilized, authorities held a press conference to announce the official results. The news that Michael Scott, the 1958 cold case victim, had been found alive in 2001 shocked the entire state and quickly spread to neighboring states. At the conference, cold case unit representatives explained how DNA technology was decisive in identifying Michael, and described the modern investigative steps used to reconstruct the crime, digitizing records, collecting family reference samples, and searching the Henson farm with ground-penetrating radar. They concluded that Michael had been held long-term by Earl Henson, who died in 1985, and that the majority of his story was corroborated by physical evidence recovered at the scene. The case's social impact spread rapidly. Child protection organizations and law enforcement agencies cited Michael's case as a textbook example of the need to preserve cold case files long-term and invest in identification technology. Families with decades-old missing persons began contacting authorities to provide DNA samples, hoping for answers despite the passage of time. In Harlan County, Michael's reappearance, though deeply scarred, brought both relief and heartache to a community that had lived with the mystery for generations. Revealing the truth did not erase the loss, but it closed a historical chapter the town had carried for nearly half a century, and opened a slow path to healing for the Scott family, the community, and Michael himself. The public announcement brought the answer the Scott family had waited almost 50 years for, yet even with most of the truth uncovered, certain questions remain forever unanswerable, typical of many cold cases. The biggest lingering mystery is Earl Henson's motive. Archived records, neighbor statements, daily habits, and seasonal work history show no clear signs of violent tendencies or predisposition to kidnapping. There is no evidence he ever demanded ransom or contacted the victim's family. The why therefore remains a permanent blind spot, since the only person who could answer it died years before the case was solved. The period when Henson may have taken Michael out of Harlan County, in the early years, also cannot be pinpointed. Did they travel between states, or was Michael kept hidden locally, before full isolation at the farm? Physical evidence contains no travel records. Michael's memories, though invaluable, are fragmented by prolonged trauma. Another question surrounds the witnesses, who saw the moss green pickup near the paper route before the disappearance. Did they know more than they told police? Did anyone suspect Henson at the time, but stay silent? No records answer these questions, and the silence of time making them pieces permanently lost. What cannot be denied, however, is the game-changing role of DNA technology. Without Kentucky's late 1990s DNA database, the Scott family reference samples would not have existed, and the unidentified man in Tennessee would never have been automatically matched to the 1958 cold case. Michael Scott's case became living proof of the value of incorporating DNA into criminal investigations, especially decades-old disappearances. When victims can no longer be identified by appearance, voice, or paper records, DNA becomes the last remaining bridge between past and present. It not only enables identity confirmation, but opens pathways to trace criminal behavior in cases once deemed hopeless. The triple-layer DNA match between Michael and his family eliminated any chance of error, strengthened the investigation's credibility, and renewed faith in the legal system regarding biotechnology's effectiveness in long-dormant cases. The case's impact on cold case procedures in Kentucky and beyond was unmistakable after Michael's file was closed. Persistent archiving, digitization, and periodic DNA cross-checking proved that even 40-plus-year-old files can still yield results if properly preserved. State agencies began re-examining old missing persons cases from new angles, not just witness statements or scene evidence, but the connections modern technology can now reveal. Michael's case especially highlighted the importance of collecting DNA from relatives of long-missing victims, a seemingly simple step that often proves decisive in re-identification. Many states subsequently launched campaigns urging families to submit samples, expanding the national matching network, and increasing the odds of identifying unknown persons. On a broader social level, Michael's story carries a deeper message about perseverance, responsibility, and how we view long-term disappearances. When Michael was found as a homeless, memoryless man, no one could have guessed he was the teenager searched for across decades. It reminds us that some nameless people on society's margins are not just social problems, but untold stories, unidentified victims, lives interrupted that no one knew how to reconnect. Michael's return cannot replace the lost years, but it shows that even cases thought forgotten can be illuminated by technology and by people who refuse to stop believing the truth is still waiting. In the end, the Michael Scott case is not only the story of an extraordinary survivor, it is proof of DNA technology's value, the importance of long-term record preservation, and humanity's capacity to emerge from the darkest years. It reminds us that justice sometimes arrives very late, but it still arrives, and when it does not merely answer one family's question, it paves the way for systemic change. The case closed with the truth revealed, yet its echo continues as a reminder that no file is hopeless as long as we keep faith in the search. Michael Scott's story sounds like something from a movie, yet it touches on many issues still relevant in America today. In 1958, neighbors saw that moss green pickup hanging around the paper route, but because people trusted the safe small-town feeling, early warning signs were ignored. A clear lesson for today. If you see an unfamiliar vehicle or person repeatedly near schools, parks, or school bus routes, write down the license plate, description, and report it to police or the school. Don't just feel something's off and let it go. The fact Michael's file sat cold for 40 years simply because DNA technology didn't exist reminds us that every piece of information we provide today, reporting a missing person quickly, keeping clear photos, agreeing to give family DNA samples, can become the future key. Nowadays in the U.S., many cases have been solved thanks to DNA families once hesitated to give police or forensic databases. Another point worth reflecting on: Michael lived homeless and nameless for years, passing countless people who never knew he was a long-missing teenager. That forces us to rethink how we see homeless individuals. Behind a weary face, there can be a missing person file, a deeply traumatized person, not just a social issue. This story is not only about DNA or investigative technique, it reminds every American today of three concrete things: stay alert without panic, proactively cooperate with authorities, especially in child disappearances and unidentified persons, and treat people on the margins with respect, because we never know what they've been through. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this hopeful story. If you want to keep exploring cases solved after decades, please subscribe so you don't miss future videos. See you on the next journey, where even the smallest clue can uncover a big truth.